This is a video about gender and crime. We're going to look at both sides of the gender debate in terms of crime. We're going to look at crime in relation to male gender and female gender. So, first of all, we know that the official crime statistics from the Office of National Statistics are how we know how much crime there is, and the majority of crime year on year is masculine activity. This figure does vary, but normally around 80%, sometimes higher, sometimes lower, of all recorded crime is committed by males. So most crime isn't committed by women. Victorians used to explain this in terms of women were more likely to conform to society's rules and so not commit crime. And Victorians used to explain this with biological theory, that women were biologically more likely to be law-abiding and conformist. Whereas in the modern era, sociologists tend to favour socialisation arguments about social control, and a postmodern concept called transgression, which is where we tend to say that women, for various social reasons, are less likely to break rules. Crime, delinquency and deviance have long been viewed as a, often working class, male problem. We tend to view this male problem as something which plagues younger males and usually dies down and ends as those younger males grow older and settle down. But in the modern era, we've seen the growth of ladette behaviour, challenging the implied links between deviance, crime and masculinity, as females behave in antisocial, delinquent, deviant and criminal ways, just like young males have traditionally done. Over time, we can see that the crime rate, as represented by the solid bars towards the bottom, has generally stayed within a certain range. And at the moment, we're not suffering from particularly high levels of crime, although crime has gone up in recent years. In 2011, there were about 80,000 males in prison and 4,000 females in prison. In 2018, there were about 79,900 males in prison, 79,900, and about 3,900 females in prison. So the prison population remains relatively stable, but as you can see, the vast majority of the prison population is male. Okay, so this is about a 95% male prison population. So one of the questions we could ask ourselves is, why is there such a gender imbalance in the prison population? Why are men making up the majority of the prison population and women not? Is it because men commit all the crimes, for example? Or are women committing crimes but getting away with it and not getting convicted and put into prison? And if so, why? So, 3 questions we need to address to try and find out if women are less criminal than men. Firstly, are there differences in the amount of crime that men and women commit? Then, are there differences in the kinds of crime committed by men and women, such that maybe women are criminal but not in the kinds of crimes that will get them sent to prison? And finally, is there any evidence that women's crime has changed, either in the amount of crime or the kind of crime that women commit? Female crime statistics are interesting. You'll remember the difference between quantitative, which is the amount, and qualitative, which is the sort of richness of the information. Whilst women commit less crime than men, women do commit all types of offences. Women commit murders, traffic offences, violent crime, fraud, etc., just like men do. Women's property crime, crimes against property, or the theft of property, is motivated by economic factors, just like it is for men. Women, just like men, fear and feel the impact of the stigma of being labelled a criminal, and so that's a deterrent that stops them from committing crime a lot of the time, like it does for a lot of men. However, women offenders are seen as doubly deviant. One, for breaking the social rules and becoming criminal, just like men, but two, because being a female criminal is viewed as unfeminine. So we tend to associate criminality with being male and masculinity. When women commit crime, we regard that not just as deviant, but doubly deviant, because women, we think, the way we construct the gender of women, it's not a feminine thing to do. The chivalry factor. Some people argue that women are more deviant than they appear, and that they're protected by what's known as a chivalry factor, by the police, by the courts, etc. in the legal system. Hilary Allen argues that the often used mental health explanation, including premenstrual syndrome for female criminality, results in lighter punishments by the courts. Basically, this is a defence where a biological explanation is used to create a medical situation which is a legitimate defence in mitigating against certain crimes. So what this does is it promotes the idea that women have perhaps a special case, that because there might be mental and biological reasons why women sometimes are more prone to commit crime and less in control of their personalities, emotions and actions, that there might be a corresponding view among perhaps males that women need to be protected, or women need to have allowances made for them as a result. Eileen Leonard, however, challenges this chivalry factor, pointing out that bad women, women who are recognised as having committed crimes, are often treated more harshly than some men who have committed the same type of crime. And perhaps this is, again, the double deviance factor, that women who commit crimes are judged harshly as criminals, but also harshly as women, and so it's twice as bad for them. Frances Heidenson suggests that the question we should be asking isn't why some women commit crime, but why women are so non-criminal. Why are so many women not committing crime? She says there are three possible explanations: biological theory, the sex role theory, and transgression. The biological theory goes back to the Victorian period. People like Cesare Lombroso, who you might have come across if you do psychology. This theory argues that normal females have a disposition that repels them from deviant and criminal behaviour. It's just not feminine, and therefore women don't do it. They're biologically less inclined to criminality. This theory has little support in sociology, although a link between female crime and hormonal and menstrual factors has been made, as we saw in the previous slide with premenstrual syndrome. Pat Carlin, writing about control theory, has adopted control theory and talked about how there are class deals and gender deals. Heidenson has argued that most women conform because if they don't conform, they get labelled as unfeminine. Carlin has suggested that there are some ways that women can get around this. Females who are most likely to become criminal, she argues, are those who have not had or who have rejected this idea of the gender deal. Females who've been in care, females who've been thrown out of their home, or who have rejected normal family life are the most likely to be lawbreakers, according to Carlin. Sex role theory, which is a socialization theory, argues that from infancy children are socialized that the two sexes, male and female, are different. Female roles contain elements as caring, passive, domestic, etc. Male roles stress toughness, aggressiveness, and sexual conquest by comparison. So it's argued that females, when they're raised and socialized, lack the values that are typically associated with crime and delinquency. However, in the modern era, the rise of female ladette behaviour has challenged this assumption. In the sex role theory, we can see that even when women commit acts that are criminal and deviant, such as shoplifting and prostitution, it can be argued that these express their socialized roles of, for example, shoplifting could be indicative of the woman's role in looking after and feeding the family and her children. And prostitution could be argued as the woman expressing her role as sexual provider. In the social control sphere, Heidenson says women commit so few crimes because of the ways they're ideologically controlled. Society has a shared value system that cements everyone together and everything. The way the bonding occurs within families, peer groups, and the school is very strong. This creates a lack of opportunities for women. There's an assumption that because women are confined to private space in the family, in the home, and less able to go out into the public, into the place of work, etc., and commit crime, the women simply lack opportunity to commit crimes, which is why we don't find them in prisons and in the criminal justice system. However, with women going out to work more in the modern world and women occupying more roles in the workplace and in public life, we would expect this situation to change and women to commit more crime. So, even though we are moving towards equality, women still perhaps have less opportunities for crime. But Wilkinson, in studying statistics in California, found that where women were equal to men, they were in fact engaged in similar levels of white-collar crime. So then we come on to the theory of transgression. This is a postmodernist approach. Carol Smart introduces this concept of transgressive criminology. In order to understand it, especially in a postmodern society, we understand that transgression takes us beyond the boundaries of conventional criminology. We've got the idea of things like self-imposed curfews, the idea that people might not want to go out after a certain time because they're scared of what might happen to them, or because they're concerned about how they might appear if they're out late at night, for example, on their own. There are concerns about how that a woman out on her own after dark might be interpreted by other people. There's also ideas like the treatment of women as victims. So there's a common thread in society would be that if we think of victims, we tend to think of females first. Especially in things like domestic violence, abuse and rape, we tend to think of women as the targets and the victims of those things. So therefore, women being criminal would transgress all of these concepts of what we think women are. If we think women are weaker and they need to be protected, or if we think of women as victims, then the idea of women as the opposite, as the powerful, as the criminal, as the perpetrator of violent acts, would be to transgress against all of these concepts of how we've constructed female gender. So will women's crime rise? Frieda Adler believes that with the liberation of women, women will go out into the workplace and will be more full members of society and participate in things, and therefore there will be a rise in the participation in criminal activity at the same time. Her evidence is partly based on the growth of juvenile crime by liberated girls and the rise of ladette crime. Just as they're penetrating the labour market, they're also moving into criminal careers as women. But Carol Smart criticises Adler on the grounds that she, Adler, according to Smart wrongly, sees juvenile delinquency as reflective of future adult crime. Smart argues that just because girls might commit adolescent delinquent crimes and deviance, it doesn't mean that they'll grow up and do exactly the same thing. Just like boys are expected to act up when they're young but then grow out a bit, Smart argues that women will do the same thing. So if they are transgressive when they're younger, they'll settle down as they grow older, and they'll grow out of all the criminal activity as well, just like males. So the rise in women's crime. The Marxist Stephen Box has felt that any increase in women's property crime, crimes to do with property, stealing, theft, etc., burglary, has more to do with poverty, especially with women as lone parents, and especially then to do with things like shoplifting. So it's more to do with poverty than female liberation. He found a relationship between the increasing employment of women police officers and then the rise in recording of violent crime by women. This is the idea that perhaps women entering into the police force results in a sensitization, a greater awareness that women can be criminal. And so, therefore, a reduction in the chivalry thesis, where men might regard women as less criminal, women regarding other women as more criminal. So this has resulted in more female crimes, especially violent crimes, becoming recorded. James Messerschmitt has argued that there's a normative masculinity in society, and that's basically what a real man should be, which is highly valued by most men. He's argued that masculinity isn't something that is natural to males, it's a social construct, and that males have to constantly work at it in order to establish it and to maintain it. He argues that, for example, a businessman can achieve masculinity through the exercise of power over women in the workplace, whereas a man with no power at work might express his masculinity through control of women at home in the domestic situation, e.g. controlling behaviour, financial and emotional dominance, or maybe even domestic violence. Messerschmitt argues that middle-class boys, embodying the values of the education system, achieve educational success, but at the expense of their own emasculation, i.e. they're not necessarily seen as typical or valuable examples of masculinity. So he argues that in school they adopt an accommodating masculinity. So to achieve success in the school system, they don't act in exaggeratedly masculine ways. They do things which fit in with what's acceptable in the education system. But once they're not in the school environment, Messerschmitt argues that they compensate for this when they're out of school by having a more oppositional masculinity. Pranks, high spirits, excessive drinking, etc. And we can all perhaps think of things like the rugby club boys, the rugby boys, who might be academically more successful and then have a hyper-exaggerated masculinity when they're outside of the school environment. By contrast, Messerschmitt argues that working class males have an oppositional masculinity inside the education system and also out of it, one which is more aggressive in nature all around. This is seen as something which leads to a lack of educational success. Young black males can also be influenced by examples of this type of masculinity. So, for example, if we were to look at role models from popular culture in music videos, in gang crime, etc. For example, the distribution of role models, especially in black culture, tends to be a high prevalence of criminal activity and a lower prevalence of law-abiding activity in the popular culture. Of course, this is a misrepresentation of what actually goes on in real life, but this could lead to a skewing of behaviour as young black males seek to emulate what they see rather than what's actually really going on in real life. Messerschmitt also notes how, for example, rape and the activity of pimping is sometimes used to express control over women. And so this again is an activity that males can engage in, and this is a way of demonstrating power and control by demonstrating power and control over women. So these are all examples of aggressive masculinity. Messerschmitt, in particular, has argued that men express their masculinity through criminal and deviant behaviour, through fighting, through football hooliganism, etc. B. Campbell has said that young men seek compensation for lack of status through then pursuing aggressive masculinity. So the idea is that if a man feels that he doesn't have important status in society, that he can compensate for that by fighting other people, other males, and sort of acquiring status by defeating other powerful males. Forms of masculinity adopted involve control over things like technology, i.e. stolen cars, public space, control of the streets in terms of gang activity, violence against otherness, so for example, other cultures, other ethnicities, so Asian shopkeepers and women, for example, are often targets of aggressive masculinity. And then there's the argument that this deviance is enjoyed by men. Katz has argued that criminology has often failed to understand the role of pleasure in committing crime. This search for pleasure when equated with masculinity stress about status and control over others and success, then makes sense, because the act of exerting dominance and control over others brings with it the pleasure of acquiring status and success. Violent crime can then be seductive because it's undertaken because it's going to get status, but it's also the thrill and the potential danger of pitting yourself against something which, should you fail, would be a disaster. But if you succeed, then once again you're reaffirming your dominant masculine values and your status as being better than all the others. We could compare this to a postmodern idea, which is that criminals might commit crime just for thrills. And also Walter Miller's idea that he has about excitement as a focal concern for the reasons why people might commit crimes in society. It might not be because they're poor. It might not be because they lack the means to achieve success. It might just be because they enjoy it. Now we move on to women as victims. A significant proportion of criminal activity does consist of crimes against women. Interestingly, men are more likely statistically to be victims of crime, especially violent crime. But the popular imagination doesn't cater for this. We don't tend to think of victims as male, despite the statistics. We tend to, for some reason, although women are less statistically likely to be victims of crime and violent crime, we tend to think of women first when we think of what victims look like. The majority of crime against women is carried out by men and often includes the use of violence. About a quarter of serious violence takes place in the home. Ironically, this is the place when polled, women say they feel the most secure. So perhaps women aren't entirely either honest or accurate when they're describing home as the place where they feel most secure, seeing as this is where a significant amount of violence takes place. About 1 in 4 women are victims of domestic violence. 1 in 10 of those that would be a victim of domestic violence each year. So it's quite a high prevalence of violence in the home. And one of the problems we have with crimes of violence in the home, domestic violence, is crimes against women of this sort are subject to significant underreporting for various reasons. Women don't report them and other people don't detect them. The idea of rape, for example, is one where there's perhaps a significant inaccuracy in the public perception. Public perception of rape is that it's going to be, or likely to be, something which is perpetrated by a stranger in a situation where perhaps a woman is out on her own and is vulnerable. However, the statistics show, and this is a poster from an anti-rape campaign in India, that 1 in 4 women will become victims of rape, and 84% of them will know their assailant. And so this idea, a bit of a euphemism to say date rape, because as a lot of feminists have pointed out, this is kind of watering down the strength and the horrific nature of rape by calling it date rape. But it's trying to highlight the fact that the majority of women know their attackers. And so it's not necessarily a stranger danger thing. Since the turn of the century, the Home Office report a rising, in the ONS statistics, there's a rising proportion of women reporting rape. 1 in 20 women just after the year 2000, and this has risen since, so age 16 to 60, about 1 in 20 had been raped, and 45% of those were by their current partners, just to give an indication of this statistic that women tend to know their assailant. Rape is essentially related to the exercise of power, and especially with the association of masculinity with power. It's about power, dominance and toughness. There is a significant mistaken view in society that rape is something to do with sexual desire or attractiveness or other social cues. But most psychologists and sociologists will be able to refute that and establish that rape is essentially about the act of power and dominance over another person. Rather worryingly, a substantial number of rapists appear to be only able to become sexually aroused after they've terrorized and degraded their victims, which again is a confusing aspect of rape, in that it's about power and dominance and not about attractiveness, etc., which has been often a mistaken view from people that in terms of someone, the clothes that they're wearing, the way that they're behaving might somehow influence whether or not they might be sexually assaulted or raped. Susan Brownmiller has argued that rape is part of a system of male intimidation keeping women in fear. And certainly this fits in with the concept of rape and sexual assault being associated with power, especially with masculine power. So, more than 1 in 4 women experience domestic violence in their lives. 1 in 10 experience domestic violence every year. Violence, just to give us a definition, range from being punched, choked, bitten, burned, starved, knifed. There's also financial control, emotional control, behavioural control, right up to the more extreme cases of being forced to have sex against their will, which used to be something which you would see reported in the media, and you'd see it reported in that way and it wouldn't be called rape. So one of the things that we will come on to look at is how the media help to form our ideas of these things. And one of the interesting things over the years, over the decades, has been how the media has slowly begun to sort of call things what they are instead of using euphemisms. So, for example, it's not uncommon, or it wasn't uncommon, to see descriptions in the media of a male having intercourse with an underage woman, would be the phrase used, which basically means a child, and so that would be a paedophile. But the media would be reluctant to use those phrases in the past, whereas I think in the modern era they're much more likely to. And equally in the past, you'd see phrases like "forced to have sex against her will," which is essentially rape. Sex without consent is rape. And in the modern era, you're more likely to see that term used, but the media have been reluctant to use it in the past. So when we come to look at the media and crime and the relationship between how we see crime because of the media, we will look at that. Interestingly, domestic violence is more likely to occur during pregnancy. And one of the things we could think about is how this factors into male power and this idea of dominance, when a woman perhaps is more vulnerable and actually needs more care and assistance. Why is it that domestic violence is more likely to occur during that period? So domestic violence has had quite a significant focus of research. Betsy Stanko found an act of domestic violence is committed every 6 seconds in Britain. It's estimated that 1/4 of all violent crimes committed are domestics. In up to 70% of cases, the father in a family unit inflicts violence on the children as well as the mother. Domestic violence is something which has had a bit of a patchy history. The police didn't used to interfere, in inverted commas, in matters of domestic violence. They tended to, in the past, regard domestic matters as something which were between those people and not something which the police should get involved with. So even if there was a terrible act of violence occurring in a household and neighbours could hear it and reported it, even if the police did attend, they would often, when they realised it was between, for example, a husband and a wife, they wouldn't interfere, and they would say, no, this is a domestic matter, this isn't a matter for the police. Now that's something which has changed as attitudes towards violence against women, for example, has changed over the years. And so the police are more likely to intervene and act when there is domestic violence. But another aspect is that women can feel a strong sense of failure if they are put in a position where they have to publicly admit that there's violence inside their home. And so therefore that can lead to women not reporting it. Support for battered partners, especially wives, is not always forthcoming from police or family or friends or welfare services. As I said, the police traditionally regarded domestics as private matters and were reluctant to intervene, although fortunately that has changed significantly in the more modern era. From the 1990s onwards, the Home Office did instruct police to treat domestic violence the same as any other form of violence. What that tells you is that only really in the last 20 to 30 years have we seen a significant change in the seriousness with which police treat and act with cases of domestic violence. So before that, you can imagine that a lot of domestic violence went completely unpoliced and unpunished. So we need to look at some of the key factors that help us to explain why women are seen as victims or indeed are victims. So one of the relationships between crime and the wider society is to do with patriarchal social control, the idea that the structures in society exert some kind of control over women and put them in more vulnerable positions. So traditionally we've socialized our male children to be more dominant and our female children to be less dominant and more passive. And this has not helped. This has contributed to this situation where women are seen as more likely to be the victim and the man more likely to be the perpetrator. As we have begun to address this idea of the roles of men and women in society and the gender socialization that we do undertake in society, we've come up against this idea of the crisis of masculinity, the idea that men are somehow powerless or less powerful in the workplace, when they get divorced, when they lose their jobs, etc. Those things tend to, divorce, work, unemployment, tend to impact more heavily, it is believed, against men. And so this has caused a sort of a crisis for men as, what's their role in society? And there's a link that some sociologists have made between that and crimes against women. Men's reaction to the fact that women are entering the labour force in larger and larger numbers, what we call the feminisation of the labour force, and also the growing economic and cultural power of women, has led to what's been termed a crisis of masculinity. So, do women need men? And therefore, what is the role of a man? If a man has previously seen his role as a provider for women and children, and that's been the sort of sum total of his reason for doing things, if you take that away, then what is a man for? And what is he supposed to do? And then another factor that doesn't help is that traditionally we have sexually objectified women. We've seen women as property, we've seen women as objects in society, and we've constructed a lot of our social structures to accommodate that, and a lot of them still exist. So these things all help to explain why women are seen as victims. If we're writing about gender and crime and the relationship between gender and crime, we want to look at the idea that when we're evaluating women as victims, we want to make reference to the contribution of feminists in raising our awareness and understanding of this situation. It's not necessarily automatic that women are victims. Previously in society, we would have perhaps more readily accepted the idea that women were weaker and more vulnerable and needed protecting, and so therefore the idea of women as victims would have made more sense. But because of the contribution of feminists and others, we've now come to reevaluate this idea of women being natural victims. It's not necessarily the case at all. That women should be victims, and so there's a challenge to that idea going on. Some people, though, have questioned whether feminists have exaggerated male power and the extent of female victimization. So maybe the media, for example, have had a role to play in exaggerating the extent of females as victims by sensationalizing it in the newspapers and on websites, etc., and in social media, and possibly feminists have exaggerated male power, and whilst there may be patriarchal structures, perhaps they're not as powerful as feminists have painted them, and perhaps they're not as all-powerful as feminists have wanted us to believe. We have to look at social changes as well. So there are increasing levels of violent crime committed by females against females. So this challenges lots of our previous ideas about, the chivalry thesis, or women being naturally, or by socialization, less inclined to commit crime. If we're writing an essay, we probably want to look at the patterns of gender and crime, including the increases in female crime, as a backdrop for what we were writing about. If we're talking about the relationship between gender and crime, what patterns are there? So the main patterns would be that the majority of crime is committed by men, and the majority of prosecutions and people in the prison system are men. Then that would lead us to trying to explain why women don't commit crime, but also why some women do. But those are would be the interesting points. Why is it that there are so few women who commit crime? Why are so few women in the prison system? Then we could talk about why female crime might be rising, and is that linked to changes in society and socialization, perhaps linked to the rise in awareness due to feminism and the opportunities that are accruing to women because they're now more active in the workplace and in society at large, so now they're having more opportunities to commit crime. And then we want to look at why men commit more crime than women despite this. And so, is it because men have always had these opportunities and this freedom to reign through society and commit crime because they have the opportunities? We want to look at why victimization patterns are different. Why is it that women are more likely to be victims of crime at the hands of men than women? However, we'd also want to look at why men are far more likely to be victims of crime than women, also at the hands of other men. And why this portrayal in, say, for example, through the media is distorted, so that our perception might be that we think that women are more likely to be the victims, when in fact the statistics show that men are far more likely to be the victims of crime. And so we mustn't forget then to evaluate while we're explaining all of these different aspects. We want to be evaluating, so we want to be looking at other explanations from different theories such as functionalism, Marxism, postmodernism, realism, right realism, left realism, interactionism, etc. Okay. If we write about the chivalry thesis, which there'll be another video on, we want to look at the patterns in gender and crime. What's the relationship between the two? And we'd want to then consider this idea of the police having a strong chivalry thesis. They would have a strong view that women are not criminal, that women are more likely to be victims, that they are vulnerable and need protecting, and so therefore women will not be perceived as criminal even if they are committing crime. If there's a man and a woman and a dead body on the floor between them, we will automatically think that the man has committed the crime and that the woman in some way was influenced or dominated by the man and was either going along out of fear or under his leadership. And these are all elements of the chivalry thesis, the idea that the woman wouldn't be acting under her own agency. We'd want to look at alternative explanations, so that we'd want to think about as women perhaps seen as not being as criminal for other reasons. Women not having a history of criminality in our culture might lead us to then not suspect future women of being criminal either. And then what we'd want to look at is, as more women are involved in the criminal justice system, especially as police officers, we see a rise in reported crime where women are the criminals, are the perpetrators. And there might be a link between that the chivalry thesis might start to fall apart when we've got more female police officers who don't have this chivalric idea of women are vulnerable and need protecting, etc., and they're too innocent to commit crime. Okay, so that's the introductory video for gender and criminal behaviour. Thank you very much.